Today I'm talking to Mike Bennon. He's a colleague of mine at the Center on Democracy Development and the Rule of Law. He came over from the engineering school at Stanford a few years ago, and he now runs our global infrastructure project. So Mike and I have been working jointly on a number of projects, but especially regarding the Belt and Road Initiative, which is the single biggest development initiative anywhere in the world, probably anywhere in human history. And things have really changed. We wrote a paper jointly 5 years ago, which was halfway between the original announcement in 2013 of Belt and Road and the present, the year 2023. And at that time, there was a lot of anxiety in Washington about China's motives, because it seemed like China was on a roll. This was a foreign policy initiative. The Hambantota port project had just failed, and as a result, China got a 99-year lease to some land around the port, and so there was this suspicion that China was engaged in what was called debt trap diplomacy. But the actual motives of China were, and the methods they were using, were perhaps a bit misunderstood. So maybe you could talk about that.
Yeah, no, thanks so much for having me. In terms of the debt trap diplomacy topic, I think it was pretty clear early on in our study that some of that was a little bit overblown in Washington, in that kind of geopolitical decisions probably aren't a big contributor for China's motivations in kind of going out and then into the BRI.
So what was driving them?
Well, so probably the biggest driver for China is more domestic concerns and industrial policy, domestic industrial policy, in that, China has built out a massive infrastructure network within China. It's been in many ways a massive success story in terms of building out infrastructure and doing so quickly and efficiently.
High-speed rail, airports, highways, everything.
All over. And to the extent that now arguably there's definitely cases of potential overbuilding in China. And so, a lot of that probably contributed to the motivations around the Belt and Road Initiative, because I like to joke, in the United States, we have our military-industrial complex. Well, China has its construction-industrial complex, in that there's been this massive build-out within China, and now there's these big state-owned construction firms.
Largest in the world.
Most of the largest construction firms in the world are now from China. And they have a lot of political clout. And so there was a great alignment to kind of export some of this capacity as China built out. It made sense from an economic perspective in terms of exporting, excess currency buildup, and
workers.
and workers. I think that China has a lot of young men that can work in construction that need to be put to work, and the Belt and Road Initiative made sense there as well. So I think there's just plenty of, and frankly, it doesn't necessarily, some of the geopolitical concerns don't necessarily make a ton of sense, in that China's motivations aren't necessarily aligned at trying to put countries into debt distress. That doesn't necessarily help your relationship necessarily with the country you're lending to.
Right. Okay. So that describes some of China's motivations. By the way, I think we should point out that part of that earlier study was also about the way that the West was handling infrastructure. The World Bank and a lot of Western development agencies really haven't been that good at providing infrastructure, and it gave an opening to China that China just walked through, because we put a lot of obstacles in the way of actually building things these days.
That's correct. I mean, and specifically, we were focused on the World Bank, and in that the World Bank was a major lender to infrastructure, including kind of what we would call hard infrastructure, or roads, bridges, power plants, dams, other types of infrastructure that countries use to develop. And slowly the World Bank kind of exited that business beginning in the early 1990s, really after the end of the Cold War. And it did so a bit inadvertently in that the World Bank created a very robust safeguards program. So the idea behind the safeguards was that the World Bank would conduct its own environmental studies. It was already doing that before the end of the Cold War. But the safeguards program really gained some teeth. Shortly after the end of the Cold War, in response to some U.S. legislation, but then with the inspection panel that could actually intervene in World Bank projects. And this was all very well intended, of course, to make projects more responsive to indigenous populations and stakeholders and have fewer environmental and social impacts on World Bank projects. To some extent, that required, taking a little bit of sovereignty from the nations that the World Bank was lending to, in that they would use the World Bank's policies as opposed to the laws of the host nation. And over time, the safeguards grew, and the World Bank, to some extent, did kind of move away from hard infrastructure lending and more into other very important areas.
Yeah, public health, governance, anti-corruption. Yeah,
exactly. And so that happened by the mid-2000s. The World Bank had kind of made that transition. It wasn't a formal policy that they would stop lending to power plants and roads, and they kept it up, or at least tried to. But the safeguards made things a little more challenging. Now the safeguards are going through a reform process at the World Bank, but borrowers still wanted to build roads and bridges and trains.
And the Chinese can do it faster and often cheaper than the World Bank.
Well, and I think that it does get conflated a little bit in that there's a few reasons that the Chinese are faster. One is that often Chinese state-owned enterprises on the Belt and Road come with financing in tow, and most, the two biggest BRI lenders are the China Export-Import Bank and the China Development Bank, and often they'll be kind of ready. They can have the capital in a matter of weeks for a project. You can think of those as kind of the operational reasons that the Belt and Road can kind of move quickly, whereas a World Bank project or a project from using private financing would have a little more due diligence, take a little more time to develop. Another reason that China might be a little faster on the Belt and Road would be because of those things like safeguards and other environmental or regulatory reasons that Western lending institutions, especially multilaterals like the World Bank, can't take advantage of. There's a third reason why the Belt and Road might be a little faster, and I would kind of say these are what I call safeguard 1.0. So not necessarily the new environmental safeguards, but the prior safeguards that the World Bank used, which were things like transparency, things like an open procurement for a project, where if a World Bank project needed to have a public procurement for the project. Well, the BRI didn't use those either, so there was less transparency, and BRI projects were very often, especially early on, but in almost all cases, directly negotiated, between the Chinese state-owned enterprise and the host nation.
Okay, so let's fast forward another 5 years to 2023. The world looks quite different right now, because a lot of these Chinese projects that look like they were just barreling ahead 5 years ago have gotten into trouble. And there's actually quite a long and growing list of Chinese projects that are underwater. They're not returning the kinds of revenues that they expected, and it's led to a lot of debt distress on the part of many countries.
At the same time, we've seen some projects, BRI projects, have a lot of some negative externalities. Some projects have very positive externalities and are leading to growth, but others are seeing some environmental impacts, some social impacts. And in a lot of cases, in fact, if you were to look along at some of the countries that are some of the largest borrowers of BRI today, if you look at public sentiment, in some ways it's shifted away from China as a lot of local populations are concerned over project economics. These are some of very standard concerns with foreign investors investing abroad in terms of they're taking our economics, they're taking our jobs, there's not enough for local labor.
Environmental damage, all sorts of things.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So you're starting to see some of these externalities cause some real tensions on BRI, in addition to some of the debt distress.
And one of the things that paper argued was that the Chinese did not actually seem to be that good at anticipating what those both positive and negative externalities would be. In China, it kind of didn't matter because they would capture all the positive externalities because it was all in their country, but they tended to overestimate, the benefits, a lot of the economic benefits, and they certainly couldn't capture them, as the investors, as a foreign investor.
That's right, and I think some of that is due to kind of very straightforward kind of systemic reasons. I mean, presumably the World Bank safeguards, some critics of the safeguards would argue they've kind of gone too far maybe and made things too slow, but presumably they result in better environmental outcomes, right? There's a reason for them, so that's kind of understandable. And even on the project economics, it might not be simply that, Chinese state-owned enterprises are not as good at anticipating project economics. That's probably not the case. What probably is a factor is that, these are not publicly procured and financed on the market. These are state-to-state, state-owned enterprise to state-owned enterprise contracts. The reason that financing projects using private financing or with a public procurement works is that there's some due diligence over the project. It forces due diligence. Sometimes that due diligence is correct, sometimes it isn't. But it's a mechanism, right, for reviewing projects and ensuring that projects are well structured.
Yeah.
And that's missing in BRI projects.
Right. Yeah. Now, in the more recent piece that's looking back from the present perspective, you talked about Ray Vernon's obsolescing bargain as a model for how to understand what was going on. Right. So, what was the obsolescing bargain?
So it was developed by a professor from Harvard, Raymond Vernon, in the 1970s. And basically, he was studying oil majors that were investing abroad and then often having some trouble with their host nation counterparts. And essentially what he argued through what's called the obsolescing bargain model is that international investors, when they invest abroad, they strike a bargain, a deal with the host nation, and that when the deal is struck, they're essentially on equal terms or equal negotiating leverage. In fact, in some cases, the international firm, because they have expertise or otherwise, they might have an advantage. So they might get a good deal in that initial negotiation. And what happens, however, and this is, the obsolescing bargain's been applied to a lot of sectors. It really applies well to infrastructure. Is basically after the investors have built the project and all the capital's in the ground, what happens is all of the negotiating leverage in that relationship immediately shifts over to the host nation. And what that creates is this irresistible incentive, whether the host nation is a dictatorship or a democracy, an emerging, developing economy or a developed economy. There's this huge incentive to try and renegotiate the contract, expropriate, otherwise change the economics, and basically renege on the original deal. It applies very well to infrastructure because there's a ton of capital investment for a big infrastructure project, and usually that has to be paid off over a very long period. So there's plenty of time for the host nation to kind of sour on the deal and renege.
So in China's case, it's very often not the case that the Chinese actually did a really great fair deal at the beginning, and now the host nations trying to get out of it and just get better terms. I mean, sometimes the Chinese negotiated really pretty tough terms because they were trying to minimize the risks that they were undertaking and shift as many of those risks off onto the host nation, for example, by requiring sovereign guarantees for the loans that they were making.
That is often the case, and again, it's a little bit difficult to do much of a systemic analysis. There has been some recent research where they've kind of looked at the terms on BRI contracts that are publicly available. Part of the challenge is that there's not a lot of transparency around the terms of a lot of these contracts.
But that's not an accident.
That isn't an accident, most likely. In fact, one of the challenges is that a lot of folks approaching BRI have said, okay, we need more transparency, as if there's a reason that there's not a lot of transparency. Transparency for the Belt and Road Initiative has a lot of, non-transparency has a lot of economic value. And the best illustration of this is this allegation that you see from kind of Western observers that this is debt trap diplomacy, that this is all a nefarious trick to kind of bankrupt borrowers, the Belt and Road Initiative, the lenders, or China more broadly, could easily put this to rest by publishing all of the contracts and the loan terms and making all the Belt and Road as equally transparent as the World Bank's lending program, for instance. And it hasn't done that. Now, the reason for that most likely is simply that the non-transparency has a lot of economic value as a protection for the loans and the contracts that China is using. So it's not necessarily a nefarious geopolitical reason. It's that when you have a loan outstanding like this, there's actually some value from a credit perspective. From a public relations perspective, if some of the terms of debt were out there, that might cause PR issues. And also in terms of when it comes time to renegotiate, when that obsolescing bargain comes due, it might be a good thing if you're a lender, again, to be negotiating that privately and bilaterally with your borrower, as opposed to it being kind of a public. There's a few kind of broad cases. Sri Lanka has gotten a huge amount of press, and since we wrote our study, Sri Lanka has materially evolved as well, and then it's probably one of the more contentious negotiating.
Just to explain what happened, you had the Rajapaksas that were running the country after the end of the civil war with the Tamils, having defeated the Tamil Tigers. The Rajapaksa brother that was running the country, that was the president, was a pretty authoritarian fellow that did these deals with China. And then there was a change of government, a more open, a little bit more Western-oriented government came to power, and they tried to get out of, at least this big port project that they had been negotiating, and China said no.
Exactly. And since then, it's actually even evolved a little bit more in that they tried to renegotiate the port project. They also had a bit of a renegotiation on the Colombo industrial port project. Those negotiations were contentious, clearly. The IMF came in with additional support. And then in the next election, however, the Rajapaksas essentially came back to power, and then there was another immediate pivot. So the new administration then canceled it. The prior administration was trying to pivot, and they had some contracts with Japan, and the Rajapaksas canceled those and kind of pivoted back towards BRI. So there was very clearly. At the local level, political movements kind of towards the BRI and away from the BRI that occurred. And then, of course, that and of course the IMF was involved the whole time, and now that's kind of all come to a head with more recent events that have occurred there.
But there is this pattern that's happened in Montenegro and Argentina, in some respects in Sri Lanka, where you have an initial deal that is negotiated with either a corrupt, authoritarian, not very, or populist leader, like the Kirchners in Argentina, who did this dam project in their home state of, in Patagonia. And then there's a change in the regime. You get more Western-oriented, kind of more liberal politician coming to power. They inherit all these debts to China, and they would like to switch their orientation, but it turns out to be very difficult.
It is. And it has been in some of these cases. In Argentina was another very similar case to Sri Lanka, where there was a kind of a pivot and then a pivot back more recently. And of course, in the interim, the IMF came in, and in Argentina, it was their largest program in the IMF's history. And there were a whole host of challenges there, and I think that's kind of the kind of broader takeaways that I see now is in terms of so the bottom line is a lot of the kind of geopolitical concern over the BRI was probably overstated a number of years ago based on how a lot of these projects are playing out. That said, countries are also having a little bit of a challenge pivoting back, and the specific regimes, and I'm thinking mostly of Latin America. Argentina is an excellent example. I think depending on what happens with Ecuador in recent weeks, I think that's another area to watch.
Basically, in many of these countries, there are multiple Chinese projects, and if you try to renegotiate one of them, there's this cross, what the term is in the contract terms, but they're all linked to one another, or at least China insists on linking them and says, if you want to try to get out of this project, then you're going to have to, we're going to stop these other ones as well.
There are some examples of that. So in some of the public contracts, there are country-level cross-default clauses. So that essentially says that if you default on our one loan, then we're going to consider a default on all loans from China. You've seen clauses like that maybe for a company that's investing, where they might have a cross-default clause for their other investments as a company. As from a country, it's a little bit out of the box. And you have seen some activity. I think Kenya is a good example of that. They have the big standard gauge railway project, which is in distress. There, similar situation in that they were renegotiating with China. The IMF came in with a new program. Within months of the IMF entering in and opening up its new program, there were local news reports of payments to local Kenyan subcontractors stopping on BRI projects that weren't the standard gauge railway, but were other road projects and small projects around Kenya.
So the suspicion is that China is just squeezing them.
Squeezing kind of local contractors to maybe prod Kenya to start servicing BRI debt, and lo and behold, that summer, Kenya did make its first payment for debt service on the standard gauge railway project. So there's kind of anecdotal instances of that, and there are some cross-default clauses, one of which was actually, again, this is just, we're limited to what information's public, but in Argentina there was a cross-default clause, and that renegotiation was kind of quasi-triggered the clause there as well.
And then there was a lot of sovereign guarantees that had been built into a lot of these contracts, so that people were not quite aware of how much debt these countries had taken on until the moment that there was a problem or the threat of default, and all of a sudden it turned out that the taxpayers of the country were liable for a lot more debt than they thought.
Well, that I think is the big challenge now, because that's the other big challenge, and it's really limited to the IMF.
Mm-hmm.
I think the IMF is kind of adapting and learning how to deal with some of these challenges as it kind of moves forward. Some of the obligations on large infrastructure projects, you don't know what they are or who owns what economic risks and what are the contingent liabilities unless the contracts are public.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, whether there's a sovereign guarantee on some of these projects hasn't always been clear in a lot of BRI projects, to the extent that there's clearly been a lot of, you know, debt that, because the contracts aren't public, these are kind of like hidden debts. It doesn't take a lot of hidden debt to cause a credit crisis for a country, mainly because the other lenders don't know that these hidden kind of obligations exist. So it impacts credits in a couple ways. One is they end up lending too much, and so you end up having these credit crises. The other really big problem is that once these sovereign bondholders and other bilateral lenders and the IMF know that these kind of hidden obligations exist, it throws a wrench in the debt renegotiation process. They don't trust that, you know, one of China's state-owned enterprises or policy banks is getting a good deal. So if they take a haircut on their loans, is China kind of jumping the line on debt service?
And the Chinese usually insist on a no Paris Club clause in their contracts. I mean, the Paris Club being this agreement that nobody's going to try to jump the line if there's debt distress, and everybody takes the same haircut. I mean,
right.
Basically.
Well, yes. So the Paris Club, of course, you know, requires basically for all bilateral lenders that are members of the Paris Club. China is not; it's an observer, but it requires kind of everybody to be treated equally, and that's been how we've kind of resolved a lot of sovereign debt renegotiations in the past. And some published BRI projects, yes, they do have a kind of a no Paris Club clause, which basically says that if you cut a deal with the Paris Club, that doesn't impact our debt. Now, you know, that is a no Paris Club clause is completely unenforceable because the Paris Club would never agree to a restructuring if there's someone else that has no Paris Club out there. Now, that then goes back, and we're kind of hitting a little bit of a theme here of it's only useful if the terms of the debt are not known. So again, it goes back to this non-transparency being a good credit protection for BRI projects in that, you're right, so seeing a no Paris Club clause would cause a lot of sovereign lenders to then really lose trust in a renegotiation process. And it's really starting to play out in a couple of these cases that are, you know, Sri Lanka, Zambia, that are going through a sovereign credit restructuring, and the trust is just not there. And it's really
so answer the question, why should the IMF bail out a country that has overextended itself and borrowed too much money from China? You know, why should Western taxpayers, whose money is funding the IMF, go along with, you know, what's essentially a bailout of a bad Chinese deal?
Well, that's the big question, and I think I frankly think the IMF should adjust its practices somewhat, and the IMF clearly needs to adjust course a little bit and have kind of a clear protocol for dealing with one of these situations, especially when there's a lot of hidden BRI debt, and China has certainly proven, especially recently, that it will be a tough negotiator in some of these situations and not necessarily cooperate with kind of the broader Paris Club and IMF community. And you're starting to see some grumbling from the IMF. Occasionally, Secretary Yellen will make a comment on we need China to come to the table, some along those lines. I think the IMF should try to be a lot clearer in its approach. And you know, there are downsides to that in terms of saying, hey, if these conditions are met, you know, that we're going to wait or hold back credit support for that.
And what conditions would those be?
Well, so unfortunately to date, there haven't been it's been pretty unclear. I'd say
but what would you recommend?
Yeah, so some of those would be more transparency would probably be the first instance in that prior to an IMF program starting, that a borrower would need to provide a lot more transparency as to their outstanding liabilities and from the borrower agreeing to take kind of Paris Club conditions and treat everyone equally. Zambia also has stood pretty firm, and these are kind of where some of the norms are playing out here. In that they've said we're going to treat everyone equally and kind of prioritize that. I think what is a little bit lost in the current discourse is that the IMF needs to enforce that requirement, or if not the IMF, then there needs to be a forcing mechanism. I think transparency is treated to some extent as just something we need to sort out, like this is just difficult and we need to kind of manage things a little bit better, and that's not the case. I mean, there's this is the transparency would be there if it wasn't benefiting one of the bilateral, the lack of transparency wasn't financially benefiting one of the bilateral lenders. And so I think the IMF needs to actually enforce some of those requirements and evolve in that way.
And doesn't China just need to reconcile itself to the fact that it does need to take haircuts on a lot of these deals that really are not working out?
So, every development economist will tell you that that's the best solution for everyone, is that when there's a sovereign credit crisis, the best possible solution isn't a prolonged negotiation, because these are really constraining the borrowers' economies. I mean, they're going into severe financial distress. So they say, the best solution for everyone is to negotiate a quick solution. Folks take a haircut, a significant haircut, and then move forward, and that allows growth to kind of resume. It's unclear if that approach will really change for China, and I think there have been some, you see some folks have argued, it's kind of, China's transitioning into this role. So there's a learning process that's happening and things are a little uncoordinated. Again, the challenge there is that there's the incentives aren't necessarily aligned. Okay, so it benefits, it's in China's interest for these debt renegotiations to be prolonged, as long as there is another institution that's continually kind of keeping things going. So, so again, it falls back on the international institution, the IMF, to really provide kind of an enforcing mechanism. And that's don't get me wrong, that's a tough position for the IMF to be in. And I'm expressing kind of an ideal situation. I understand the political realities there, and but it's also the U.S.'s role at the IMF as the largest voting member at the IMF. Should take a role or take push for some of these changes as well, and in order to kind of make those steps. So it's a real political challenge. To get there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, well, very good. So this is a continuing story. More countries are getting into trouble and facing these kinds of problems, but I think that the politics of this on the IMF's side are complicated, because China is, it's got a seat on the IMF board also, and a lot of other countries are represented there, and so it's not that easy to make these policy changes. So we'll have to see how that plays out.
Absolutely, it'll be a very interesting next kind of 24 months, depending on, because the sovereign credit crisis isn't necessarily abating.
Okay,
right now.
Good. Sure. And you can read about this. We'll put the link to the article at the bottom of the video.
Great. Okay. Thanks for having me.
Right, Mike Bennon. Thanks very much.
Thank you.